All right, gang. Got a relatively brief lecture tonight. This section is pretty brief, and I don't think, relatively speaking, no pun intended, relatively speaking, this is not going to be a difficult section. We're talking about relative pronouns. So um, we are we are closer to the end of the semester than we are the beginning. And so I would just say that if you are pushing the boulder up the hill, don't give up. You've almost made it through the first semester of Greek. You got one test under your belt, a couple of quizzes under your belt, and now is not the time to relax. Now is the time to dig in. Use these easier lessons to go back to some of those earlier paradigms and make sure that you are learning some of those earlier noun paradigms. When we start verbs, verbs are tough because there's a lot. And so a lot of cases in the verbs, or tenses rather, in the verbs. So tonight we're talking about relative pronouns. I'm going to be reading some from the book because Mounce does a really good job of saying what I cannot say, and I want to make sure that you get it. So we have relative pronouns in English. The relative pronouns in English are primarily who, that, and which. And you also have whom and whose. So I think he does a really good job of breaking it down in the textbook in section 14.1. That almost means you can not look at the slide. So if you don't have your textbook, pause this recording, grab your textbook, go to page 138, section 14.1, and let's look at that together. Okay, the relative pronouns in English: who, whom, that, which, and whose. Who and whom are used to refer to humans. Who is used for masculine and feminine. Which would prefer to neuter or non-humans. Not always. I think you probably think of examples right now where you would use which to refer to a human. This is just generally speaking. The word that can refer to either masculine, feminine, or neuter. Whose often refers to humans. Generally speaking, it's accepted for non-humans as well. I sold the car. Whose color? Blank, blank, blank. The most important thing is that relative pronouns are not introducing questions. So if you think about the example he uses here in 14.2, the example he says, the example sentence is whose eyes sparkled in the moonlight. Well, that's not how you would use whose, right? You would not introduce a question with a relative pronoun, because a relative pronoun is always going to refer to a noun or a noun phrase, generally speaking. So here are the relative pronouns in English: who, whose, which, that, and you're going to see some variations of that, and not interrogatives, so they're not introducing questions. You may have a pronoun. I just want to make sure that we're clear on this. You may have who that starts a question. Who hit that ball? Right? Clearly, you are starting a question with the word who. In that case, who is not a relative pronoun. So we're not focusing on the word who or the word whose or the word which necessarily. Focusing on relative pronouns. And relative pronouns have a function in a sentence, and that is they modify an antecedent or modify a noun. And so that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about the word who, whose, which, or that as much as we're saying we're talking about relative pronouns, what they do in the sentence, how they are formed in Greek, and typically it's going to be some variation of who, whose, which, or that. Um, when you have a relative pronoun that modifies a noun, that's called a relative clause. This is section 14.3. So a relative clause is the relative pronoun and the clause it introduces. Come to me, whoever is thirsty, and I will give a drink. Whoever is thirsty is a relative clause because whoever, again, we've got our first variation from what I just told you. I just told you that the relative pronouns are who, whose, which, that. I did not say whoever, but whoever or whomever is a variation of that. And I'm going to talk about that more in just a minute, but just focus on the relative clause here. Come to me, whoever is thirsty, and I will give drink. Whoever is thirsty in this sentence is a relative clause. Whoever is the relative pronoun in that sentence. Usually modifies a noun, and it can perform any function in a sentence. It can perform the subject, it can be the direct object, it can be the object of a preposition, right? Usually it modifies a noun, right? Thirsty is not a noun. Thirsty is an adjective. So in this one example I've given you, you see that it didn't modify a noun, it modified an adjective, but it usually modifies a noun. You can see in the examples listed below where it can perform the various functions. Whoever is with me is the subject, i.e., what is placed before me, that's the direct object, an object of the preposition. Give the Bible to whoever asks for it. Right, so the relative clause, or the relative pronoun, can perform any function that a noun or an adjective can perform, and it usually modifies a noun. So here are, this is singular, here are the Greek relative pronouns. You can see immediately, you should be able to see the connection to the paradigm for the nouns that we learned in, I think, chapter 7. In the nominative case, and you see they all have a rough breathing mark, right? So in the nominative case, this would be masculine, feminine, and neuter, right? Has, he, ho, or ha would be your nominative singular. Who, has, who. See the circumflex, see the rough breathing mark in the masculine and the neuter. It's the same, right? It'd be in the genitive. It'd be of which, or of whom, which, or whose. Remember the genitive, it's possessive, so you got to put the of. Dative, ho, he, ho. That's to, whom, or which. And then in the accusative, han, hain, and ha. Here is the plural. Again, you should recognize this right away as very similar to the noun paradigm that you learned in chapter 7. With, I think the words that we used were logos, graphe, hora, and ergon, right? Those are the words that we learned. So hoi, he, ha, hon, hon. That's easy, right? The genitive. Hois, heis, hois. That's the dative. And whose, has, ha in the accusative. So those are your relative pronouns, and that is section 14.7 on the bottom of 139. And if I've said it once, I've said it a million times. You just have to memorize these. Flashcards help. Writing them out helps. But the thing that's going to help you the most is doing your workbook exercises and just getting used to recognizing them in a sentence. And I know I sent an email out to many of you about the last test and your workbook assignments, but you can go to billmounce.com. He has a resource on his website that it's a series of slide presentations, or I think it's actually a PDF document. Now that I think about it, it's a PDF document where he gives you the answers to all the workbook assignments. So when you do workbook assignments, you should be checking it against that document for accuracy. You may even want to get used to doing your workbook assignments on notebook paper so that you could do them over and over. So I know that you have a lot to learn, and that's not ideal, but the thing that's going to get you where you need to be in terms of mastering Greek is repetition. So if you're only doing it once, then you're limiting the number of repetitions that you can do. But that's really for you to decide your study habits. So the form of a relative pronoun, what you're going to find is that the number and the gender of the relative pronoun are the same as the word it modifies or its antecedent. Case is determined by its function. This is important. Case, nominative, genitive, dative, accusative. Case is determined by how it functions within the relative clause, not necessarily the sentence. If it's difficult for you to translate it correctly, then you can replace it with the antecedent. We'll get into translation in just a minute. So look in your textbook on 14.10, and this goes over the case of the relative pronoun. And this sentence here is a long sentence, a lot of words you haven't learned yet. But if you look, you can see, if you just look at each word, even though you don't know the word, right? Even though you don't know the word, you should be able to really quickly identify the case of the nouns that you see, right? So that very first word, has, right? You see that, you should think masculine nominative, right? And you look for another, remember, because the nominative is going to be the subject in the sentence. So scan that word looking for another word in the nominative case. Well, I don't see one until I get to that last word, axios, which, as it turns out, you have not learned that word yet, but that word is an adjective. That means worthy. So the only masculine or the only nominative word in this sentence is has. If we go back up here, we see that we can translate has, who, which, or that. So we go back to the sentence. So in this sentence, who, which, or that, you don't know some of these words, so you can't translate it, but you could not translate has, that, or which, because has is referring to a person, right? So you're going to eliminate that or which right away, and you're going to go for who. So who does not take his cross? That doesn't make sense. So when you're translating a relative pronoun in a sentence, you want to translate it using the basic form, who or whom or which or that, but don't be afraid to add to the word in English for clarity. So there's a difference between knowing the Greek word, knowing that has is a relative pronoun and it means who, which, or that, versus translating has. Because you're not, remember, when you're translating from Greek, you're translating so that it makes sense. You're not just translating words to get the words correct. You're translating the sentence so that you can reflect what the original writer was trying to communicate. And so even though whoever may not be one of the specific forms of the relative pronoun that you've memorized, whoever fits here in English. And saying whoever or whomever, whomever is not grammatically correct, but whoever or whomever doesn't take away from the meaning of the sentence. It only clarifies the sentence for English. And I hope that makes sense. Now, listen, for your exercises, if you see a relative pronoun on a test and you translate it, I want you to feel confident enough to use a form of the relative pronoun that you learn, who, which, or that, of whom, of which, of whose, whatever. I want you to feel comfortable enough to stretch yourself to put a form of the relative pronoun in English that makes the most sense. But it has to be the same form. So if I gave you this sentence on a quiz or a test, and you translated it whoever or whomever, I'm not going to get wrapped around the axle if you use whom instead of who and you're using it incorrectly. This is not the place for that. If you go to graduate school and you take third year Greek, that's when you're going to dig a little deeper in some of those rules. I want you to follow rules of English, but I'm just not going to get wrapped around the axle in this class on that. But if you see this on a test and you translate that whichever, I'm going to count it wrong. Even though, if you look back, let's go right here. Even though if you look back, you can see that you could translate has as which. But the reason you wouldn't do it is because you're not referring to a thing, you're referring to a human. So just keep that in mind. When you're translating, make sure that you're translating it based on what the sentence is referring to. So in this case, whoever does not take up his cross, so on and so forth. I hope that makes sense. So when you're translating, when you're translating a sentence, there's something that I want you to learn to do, and I think I may do an additional video on this. I think I may take a sentence and break it down in a way to show you how I translate sentences. So I'm not going to dig too deep there. I think I'm going to do that in the next couple of days so that you can have that. But when you're translating, you want to make sure that you're keeping clauses together, that you're keeping relative clauses together, you're keeping prepositional phrases together, you're keeping verbs and direct objects together, right? So you want to keep phrases together. And so you obviously want to translate each word and you want to parse each word. When you see a word in a sentence, you get to the very first word, you see has. Okay, that is masculine. That is a masculine singular relative pronoun, which means who, which, or that. Write that down on the paper. Masculine singular nominative relative pronoun, who, which, or that. Right? Then move to the next word. Then move to the next word. Move to the next word. Well, the next word is a definite article. Con, stauron. Well, you know those two go together because they have the same case endings. So you translate that. Well, you've already been to al2, you translate that. Well, there's an and, so you translate that. Right? So the point is, when you're going through these sentences, you want to translate each word, but you also want to translate the phrases together, if that makes sense. I'm going to cover it in that supplemental lecture to kind of help you put your sentences together. So keep the clauses together, and remember that the relative pronoun may function as a subject, a direct object, so on and so forth. And when you are translating, you may need to add a word, like instead of who, whoever, so that the sentence makes sense. He digs a little deeper into that in section 1411. I would read that if I were you before you do your exercises. So that's relative pronouns. So really, all you have to do is you have to memorize these two paradigms, which you kind of already know because they look like the paradigms for the nouns that you've already been learning. So it's not something new to remember as much as it is if you double down on memorizing that noun paradigm that from chapter, I think 7. I keep referring to it from chapter 7. I can't remember. I think it's chapter 7. But if you've memorized that paradigm, then you probably recognize really quickly this paradigm. So just try to make it easy on yourself and connect some of these paradigms together and just focus on the outliers if there are any. Okay. Once you learn the words in this chapter, you will have learned 67% of the words that you need to know. So you are 2/3 of the way in terms of vocabulary words. But let's get into the vocabulary words that you will be responsible for this week. Here's one of my, a couple of my favorite Greek words are in this week's vocabulary. Aletheia, that means truth. Used to go to church with a teenage girl. Well, she's an adult now with a couple of kids. Aletheia was her name, and it means truth. Aletheia, or aletheia. I say aletheia. Truth. Eirene means peace. Eirene. Enopion. Enopion, that means before in the genitive case. I don't think you've seen a double gamma word since angelos, I don't think. But remember the sound that the double gamma makes is the NG sound. So this would be epangelia. Epangelia. It means promise. There's hepta. See that rough breathing? Hepta. That means that's 7, the word 7. You guys are lucky. There was a whole chapter when I took Greek. There was a whole chapter on numbers. And to this day, I don't know my numbers in Greek. So you guys are learning the numbers you need to know instead of learning. So we had to learn the forms of like the 20s and 30s and hundreds and thousands. Like it was, yeah, I didn't do well on that test. So you're lucky. You don't have to learn those words. Thronos. Thronos kind of sounds like throne. Thronos means throne. This one's a mouthful, but once you hear me say it, you're going to be like, oh, I know what that word is. That is Jerusalem. Jerusalem, or Jerusalem. I think we covered this when we talked about Jesus, which we translate as Joshua or Jesus. It's really interesting that there is no one in Jesus's life or that knew him that called him Jesus. They called him either Yeshua, which is the Hebrew, or they called him Jesus, which is the Greek, and it can be translated either Joshua or Jesus. The reason we translate it Jesus is because that yay sound, J, yay, J, right? J is the closest sound we've got to that in English. So in the English-speaking world, he becomes Jesus. Same thing in Jerusalem. We don't have the yay sound. We don't have a letter that makes the yay sound, but we have the J sound. And so we've got Jerusalem. Hata, you're going to see this word. This word appears a lot. You will see it a lot in the accusative, but in the genitive, it means down from or against, and the accusative, according to, throughout, during. So you will see this word a lot in the accusative in the biblical text. You do see it in the genitive, though. I'm just saying that you see it in the accusative. It's not one of those words that shows up most of the time in one one case. It shows up in both cases, but it seems to me like the biblical translation that I've done, when I came across kata, it was in the accusative. All right, kephale, head, kephale. There's another rough breathing mark. Hadas, hadas, that means way, road, journey, or conduct. Here are those relative pronouns, has, he, ha. Another rough breathing mark. The further you go into the vocabulary, the more important you understanding these breathing marks and these accent marks are going to be, because some of these words are going to have the same letters, but they're going to have different accents or breathing marks that mean different things. Hate means when. And hautos, not hautos, right? We've already been there. Hautos means thus or so or in this matter. Ployon is ship or boat. Rhema, that's a $500 charismatic word there. Rhema means word or saying. Boy, in the 80s, every charismatic church in a given town was Rhema Bible Church. He means and or so, means and so or so. Zir or Zeros means hand. And suke means life or soul. Think of psychology, dealing with the inner self, life, soul, self, suke. Okay, so that is chapter 14. We've been through 14 chapters. Relative pronouns, there's your vocabulary words. You need to memorize these paradigms, do your workbook sentences, and then we will move on to the next thing. All right. Thanks for sticking around. Talk to you soon. We'll stop sharing and I'm going to stop recording.